Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to each of you for being here today. Thanks for all you do to keep Americans informed and to keep Americans aware of what we're discussing today, that is the emerging threats to our security. There are a number of threats we face around the world, and it's important to keep those threats in mind as we approach this exciting new period in our history, in which we've got a new administration coming. And one of the many threats that we face in any era, in any administration, relates to the threat posed by the excessive accumulation of power in the hands of the few. We see that happen around the world, and sometimes we see it within our own government. It's one of the reasons why our system is set up the way it is. The Constitution of the United States is designed specifically to protect us against that kind of threat here at home, and it does so by wisely dividing that authority between Congress and the presidency. The framers believed that forcing the two political branches of government, that is the two political branches that are not the judiciary, to collaborate, to interact with each other, where necessary to serve as a check and as a balance on each other, and that this would provide us the best means toward achieving a stable, successful, and hopefully a relatively popular foreign policy. That is one that, in one way or another, reflects the will of the people, or at least is likely to be geared toward their interests. But for several decades, Congress, quite regrettably in my opinion, has deliberately abdicated many of its constitutional responsibilities, and it's just sort of handed it over to the executive branch, being willing to take a backseat role at best in determining America's role around the world and how we're going to combat threats that face us. The result ends up being a foreign policy that is made primarily within the executive branch bureaucracy and Washington insider circles, informed, as they tend to be, by the interests and the aspirations of the so-called international community. And this is a circle that increasingly becomes untethered from any clear lines of accountability, connecting policymakers and the American people. For instance, the U.S. military is currently operating in the Middle East under a very broad, I believe irresponsibly broad interpretation of a 15-year-old authorization for the use of military force, using it as justification to engage in a pretty broad range of actions, from intervening in two separate civil wars to propping up a failing Afghan government. Meanwhile, the executive branch seems increasingly inclined to choose and identify and engage threats through covert actions, and that further helps the executive branch to avoid the scrutiny that would be available if stronger congressional oversight existed, and they avoid that kind of scrutiny and public accountability. So this may be convenient for members of Congress who want nothing more than to just have someone else to blame for decisions that turn out to be unpopular or unsuccessful. But it's an affront to the Constitution, and it's more than that. It's more than just an affront to a 229-year-old document. It's an affront to the system of representative government that we have dedicated ourselves to as Americans. And I think it's an insult to the American people who are losing patience with a foreign policy that they feel increasingly and very justifiably disconnected from, notwithstanding the fact that they're still asked from time to time to send their sons and daughters into harm's way to defend. So as we discuss these emerging threats to our national security, I'd encourage this committee and all of my colleagues to prioritize the threat that will inevitably come to us if we continue to preserve this status quo and to exclude the American people and their elected representatives, in many cases ourselves, from the process. So I have a question for our panelists. One of the focuses of this committee has been on the readiness crisis within the military, brought about by the conflicts we're facing in the Middle East and by a reduction in the amount of money that the Pentagon has access to. The easy answer to this is often, well, it's just increased spending. That's not to say that that's not necessary now or in other circumstances in particular, but setting aside that is one approach that people often come up with. But another option that I think has to be considered, and perhaps ought to be considered first, is to re-examine the tasks and the priorities that we're giving to our military leaders, and to ask whether these purposes that we're seeking readiness for are truly in the interests of the American people, those we're representing, those who are paying the bill for this, and those who are asked to send. Senator. Do you believe that the Congress, the White House, and the executive branch agencies have done an adequate job in reaching consensus on what the American people's interests are and on calibrating the military and diplomatic means to appropriate ends?
I don't accept this dichotomy that you've posited between what the Congress and the President do and what the American people want. I mean, when I think of some of the, first of all, historically, the executive has always had tremendous influence on foreign policy, whatever the Constitution may say, although the Constitution did give the executive tremendous power to make foreign policy. If you go back to Jefferson, the willingness to deploy force without congressional approval, you can go all the way through 200 years of history. I'm not sure it's substantially different, but in any case, that's been the general prejudice. The founders wanted energy in the executive, and particularly in the conduct of foreign policy. That was the lesson of the Revolutionary War. That's why they created a constitution which particularly gave power to the executive. But also, I just don't believe that the American people are constantly having things foisted on them that they didn't approve of. So one of the most controversial things that's happened, obviously, in recent decade that people talk about all the time is the Iraq War, which was voted on, debated at length in Congress. 72 to 28, I think, was the vote, or something like that. The American people, public opinion, was in favor of it, just as the American people was in favor of World War I, the Spanish-American War. Later, these wars turn out to be bad or badly handled. The American people decide that it was a terrible idea, and then people start saying, well, who did this? And the American people want to find somebody to blame for doing these things. They don't want to take responsibility for their own decisions. I don't believe we have a fundamentally undemocratic way of making foreign policy decisions. I think it's complicated. I think mistakes are made. Foreign policy is all about failure. People don't want to acknowledge that failure is the norm in foreign policy, and then they want to blame people for failure. But I think the American people are participants in this process.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The only thing I would add is I do think Congress should be more involved with the use of force when we're deploying force overseas. And I think Congress has walked away from that responsibility recently. You have a colleague here who's been banging on this for some time, Senator Kaine. And I would hope that this new administration would welcome congressional involvement when the nation is going to commit its forces.
Sir, very quickly, I would just say, the defense strategy review that the Pentagon is mandated to provide this committee in Congress and the American people, that's a great forum to engage in these questions. Readiness for what? Force structure for what? Modernization priorities. These are all things that can be debated openly, and these are things which the Pentagon is congressionally required to submit. And I think that's a great forum for these discussions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses. An observation in